Hey everyone, welcome back to Musky Town's Tying with the Pros. On this episode, we are here with John Cooper, who is going to be tying an iteration of our Hillbilly Deluxe pattern. In essence, this is an articulated jig fly, and it has a number of different versions. When we tie ours for customers, that usually has an upturned stinger hook on the rear, a shank in the middle, and a jig hook. In the interest of time and not having an overly long video, John is going to tie this one tonight on a rear shank and then an upturned jig hook in the front. So with that, John, I think you were planning to kick off through some different versions and share kind of what we can do with this platform.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. First I'll start by saying, for those of you who don't have jig flies in your arsenal for muskie, you're really missing out on one of the most effective patterns that you could possibly throw at these fish. They are super fun to get those near surface eats on the bigger deer hair flies or the real flashy deer hair flies. But day in and day out, one of the absolute best ways to get especially a neutral fish to trigger is to leverage these jig platforms, because they, for one thing, the weight guarantees an action and really gives you a lot of options for a vertical action as opposed to the side to side action, which is one of the other real popular ones that we're looking for in our flies. But it also just gets down and bounces off their nose, and it gives you something that you could fish maybe a little slower. You can still rip it, of course, but it gives you the opportunity to fish a little more of the water column, especially if you're finding fish in some deeper water, in some neck down areas, things like that. It's a really important fly to have available to you. It can really make the difference between a great trip and a trip with maybe some seeing, but not so much catching.
Real quick, John, I wanted to add one thing that I forgot to mention before. So the first video we did in this series is for the river pig, which is a single jig fly. And a lot of the points that John made apply to that single river pig.
So a single river pig is maybe a jig hook. And I think the traditional river pig is tied with Nicolais, which are, so it's not a super aggressive jigging action, but it's enough to get it to sort of point its head down. And the other thing that a river pig traditionally comes with are really long feathers in the back. You can, of course, do this any way you want, but one of the ways that fly gets its length and a lot of action is to have long feathers out the back.
But that has some limitations, right? And that's why you shifted to an articulated version of the pattern.
Yeah, it has. One of the limitations that it had when I started tying a lot of jigs was the cost of the feathers. And so you can get length with long feathers, although not a lot of body, right? The body's going to stop with your bucktail, and then you're just going to have like a long wispy tail after that. But muskie, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Muskie do seem to like that at times. But what you can get with leveraging an articulation platform is you can get by with regular packaged schlappen, shorter feathers or no feathers. You could certainly you could extend it almost to like a game changer style platform where you just have ongoing shanks with taper and heavily front weighted, and you'll still get a jigging motion and an action that's desirable for a lot of fish. So,
or even a flash tail version too. I mean, Justin's gonna be doing a video, I think shortly after yours, that is the war pig, and it's a 2-section articulated flash tail version with aluminum.
Absolutely. Another advantage is you can stick a hook farther back, and that's not always something that I like to do. I like to modularize these things so I can use shanks behind, and I could split ring a hook in if I want to, if they're short striking or if they're nipping at the tail. Generally speaking, I get them on the front hook. So it's not something I'm always concerned with, but there are definitely times when having a hook farther down, especially if fish are eating in the figure eight a lot of times, as you're taking it away and they're cutting off the angle, they're gonna hit it and they might miss that front hook, and just having that extra hooking potential is great. So you can just have a shanked version and then bring some hooks and split rings and just sort of, split ring a little stinger hook in the back. Or as is the case with Adams, I think the back is typically shank and then an up facing hook. I actually like them down facing sometimes too, because that is in the opposite direction of the forward hook. So it just kind of gives me some additional confidence that one of them is going to find its.
Yeah.
But that really depends on whether you're fishing snaggy areas too. Because if you have a down facing, you're fishing a weighted fly in a snaggy area and it's downward facing, you're going to hit more rocks. So
yeah,
there's a lot of advantages. And to me, there's a lot of reason to play around with this platform and do a lot of different things. Like I started going to these double pupil, extra large lead eyes for even medium-sized flies.
Big fan of those
because they give you more aggressive jigging action. Generally, when you have a lot of material like musky flies do, the casting of those lead eyes doesn't significantly make it a harder fly to cast. It might get a little bit tougher. And then I use, and I think Musky Town sells this as well. I use large channel lead at times, which is something that's ridged and goes onto the hook shank. And sometimes I'll use that and then eyes on the outside of that to get additional weight. And if you get a big enough platform, occasionally I'll even use something like these. These are like these slotted weights that come with little rubber gaskets in it, and it's for spin fishing. And I think these are 1/8 ounce, which seems like a ridiculous amount of weight for a fly. But if you're fishing, a big enough jig, like say this one that has, these big tails on the back, and that's a massive amount of materials. And if you want to cast that and get that to sink, having that additional weight is not so much the problem. They're a pain to cast, but they're going to be a pain to cast with or without the weight. So that's just the way it works. But having all of those different options in your jig fly repertoire really gives you the ability to cover what's going on or what the situations are out there.
That's awesome. Yeah. John held up an extended single river pig before, and I know he's got a few other flies there that he's going to show us. But as we've started with these first couple videos, we talked about doing singles and how our longest tie-in starts out the back with our feathers, and we kind of shorten up our bucktail as we move forward and build out that belly teardrop shape. You're going to notice through these different these next series of videos and these articulated patterns how the way we build taper changes a little bit, how we'll often start with slightly shorter bucktail in the rear of the fly and then extend that length and increase the size of the profile as we move forward. I wanted to draw attention to that as John is about to share these different flies. And before he dives in here, want to be sensitive to time. John's got some family stuff tonight, and we want to make sure that we don't tie him up too long. But yeah, if you have questions, if there's anything we rush through during this video and you want more information about that, feel free to reach out to us. If the question's for John or if it's something we can help with, always happy to.
And yeah, and to that point about shorter bucktail on some flies towards the tail, that if you leverage that sort of changer or articulated platform where you have a bunch of shanks to get your length and to get your action, the way you build your taper is to start, shorter and sparser at the tail with your bucktail, and then you build it up as you get to the front, with somewhere, a third of the way back being maybe your longest bucktail to create the most body size, right? And then it tapers back a little bit towards the head. In this case, you can really get away with the same length bucktail for the entire section that you're tying in on this fly, because you can finish with a little something else in the head. Maybe it's some marabou, maybe it's some belly hair, maybe it's laser dub. There's a lot of different ways to finish the head of this fly around the eyes and still get that taper effect for the pattern overall. So I'm going to tie for today. I'm going to tie a 2-sectioned black version of the fly, and I'm hoping the black will show up a little bit better against my sweatshirt, but we'll find out if that's the case or not. And I'm not going for extraordinary length, but I'll see how much length we end up getting out of this. It'll probably be 8 or 10 inches or so, and I'm using medium length schlappen for the length.
And when you fish this, would you intend to split ring a hook into the back of that rear shank?
Typically, I probably wouldn't, but
okay.
I would have hooks and split rings to do it if I wanted to, or to stick a small treble, maybe a cut treble into the back if I'm so inclined. But this is not such a big fly that I'm particularly worried about it. They're more than capable of getting on that front hook, no problem. Everything is dependent. If you have them nipping at the fly as you're fishing along, don't be afraid to modify it. But it's something where, first of all, having additional hooks in the back can be more trouble than it's worth, can get hung in the net, can get, that you can be competing for your hook set between 2 hooks. And, if they got both of them, you might not get as positive of a hook set as you're hoping. So, to me, it greatly simplifies things if I can fish a pattern with 1 hook, but I fish some big flies, and I'm certainly more than willing to put multiple hooks into that. So I'm starting with, I did a couple of regular tied, so not reverse tied bucktail out the back. And it's also important to note that I put a shank in the vise, and then I turned the vise sideways because when I am bringing single hooks that I might split ring in, I don't want to have to purchase those inline hooks that are so expensive, and sometimes like people use them to replace on their plugs and things like that instead of trebles. I just want to bring a regular stinger hook. And so if you have a horizontal back loop on your shank, then the split ring will be vertical.
He's making a great point there. I want to illustrate it, because if you do have like a big game hunter, for instance, that you're using as a stinger on the rear, you'll notice that shank is perpendicular to the hook point. And when you're tying with your vise with that rear loop sideways as opposed to vertically, and you're split ringing those together, if you were to try to tie in normal on your vise and then put a split ring, your hook would turn sideways. So yeah, that's a really good point.
And maybe that hook turning sideways is okay, but I just prefer it to be either up or down personally. And so that's the way I've chosen to do it on this one. If it were a bigger fly and I was likely to use a treble, I probably wouldn't worry, and so I would keep my vise vertical. It would just be a little.
Would you mind showing us a few of those flies that you were letting me peek at before we dove in here?
Sure.
I don't want to slow you down too much, but I think it would be helpful just seeing how flexible this platform is.
So here's a traditional. This is a 3-part fly, kind of in October. I think of this as an Oktoberfest color scheme, orange behind black. I think you see a lot of gear like this, and I've increasingly over the last few years, there's been a lot of fall fly patterns this color too. It's a really good color for some of the Wisconsin waters and Midwest waters.
Mm-hmm.
And so this has
got a giant in Wisconsin on that color combo of that fly. The only difference was that rear hook was turned up, but yeah, it's a great fly.
So this one's turned down. It's a 2-aught B10S, and then maybe a 1-inch shank,
40 millimeter ish, 28 to 44.
Not to get too technical, but you want like that 0.4 wire to do a shank if you're going to directly string a B10S hook onto it, because B10S hooks have small eyes, and if you use like a 0.5 a heavier wire shank, if you're bending your own shanks, the B10S hook won't sweep.
That's a really good point. The
freely swing on it. So
the Flyman Fishing Co. Big Game, the Blaine Chocolate Big Game shanks, that wire diameter just barely fits with the 4/0 stinger, but if you try to go down, it gets tight. I mean, even with the 4/0.
This is a 5/0. This is a Gamakatsu 60 degree. I think it's a 291. I think it's
the round bends. Yeah, we definitely
have the round bend. And I like them in 4/0 and 5/0.
What John was saying, just real quick about wire gauge, is if you were to try, we bend a lot of our own shakes depending on for some patterns, but we use the 0.051 wire. And when you try to put that through the eye of these gamma hooks, occasionally it's tight and you won't get the same action out of that articulation that you might with a slightly smaller, yet plenty strong gauge wire.
Right. That's right. Yeah. A 0.4 wire or 0.41 wire is plenty strong. It's not going anywhere. And then, another version of this is, and I've really taken to making bucktail brushes for a lot of my patterns. And so just like your other patterns, if you're into the brush making, well, that doesn't take you out of the jig game. I've made jig shanks. So this is on a shank, and you can do the weighting and then bring the materials on your brush right over the weight, right? So this has got some kind of, I don't know if it's got tungsten beads or something in there or some of the channel lead, and then the materials just wound on right over it, and it creates a nice, like sort of like a swim bait, really. And in this case, I put on some clipped trebles, and it's a great swimming fly, and it just kind of leaves all the hardware hidden. Or the weight hidden. So that's just another thing you can do with it. And again, I encourage you to play with your weight, because at the end of the day, you're going to be fishing, you're going to want the jig action, but you're going to want to do it in 4 feet of water. And so that needs to be lightly weighted, or you might be fishing 20 feet of water. And so you need something that actually drives that fly down. And you want to have all of those options at your disposal if you can. So
that's good intel.
Okay, so I've put in my first 2 feathers and my first clump of bucktail. I'm gonna go, and a lot of times with my black flies, I do pretty minimal flash. This is a bronze angel hair flash, I think it's, and I like it to go with black. Although when I get to the front, I'm going to do something a little different, and I will tell you why when I get there. But I want something, I'm not worried about whether this makes it all the way to the length of the feathers, because this is more of an accent flash. It's not something where I'm expecting this flash to be part of the action of the fly. It's just something that's going to shimmer out there. And so I've got that in, I've spread it out a little bit. It's a nice dark flash material, but it'll still give a little bit of light reflection. I think it'll do the trick. So now I'm back in for more bucktail, and basically the rest of this shank I'm going to do bucktail, and then I'll put a couple of cheeks in, a couple of feather cheeks in towards the front. The one thing I will say about doing a black version of this, I personally find, and I'm sure a lot of you out there who do some tying also find, that black bucktail is, generally speaking, the hardest to work with. To get the black, to dye bucktail black, most commercial manufacturers put it through hell. And so the bucktail tends to be
cooked,
more greasy, less soft. There's all sorts of different characteristics of that bucktail, and I spend hours and hours in various fly shops pouring through black bucktails to find some that are the right characteristics for me, with the amount of hollowness at the stems, and yet enough flexibility that they'll actually breathe and lay the way I want them to on the fly. So this is, this is maybe 2/3 of a pencil. And this is a decent one, but it is still a black one. So if it doesn't do a good job, that's why. It has nothing to do with my tying skills. So
I'm pretty sure there's a joke
in
in there somewhere, but I'm gonna let that one be.
I've gone over it 2 wraps, and now I'm just gonna kind of help it wrap around the hook with my thumb and forefinger a little bit, wrap around the shank.
For
now
anyone,
it's flared.
Sorry, just real quick, for anyone who didn't see our smoker video, which is going to be episode 3 in the series, John is one of the guys that took me under his wing when I was first learning how to tie musky flies. So any jokes that imply any lack of skill towards John are payback, but completely inaccurate. John is one of the more skilled under the radar. And I don't know, are you even under the radar anymore? Musky anglers and tyers in the space. A few years ago, he caught a 53.5-inch river muskie up in Minnesota with Luke Swanson. And yeah, it's kind of hard to keep stuff like that quiet after you do that. So,
well, I mean, yeah, but Luke's not under the radar, but I can't imagine being much more under the radar than I am. And I'm also quite fine and happy with that.
Yeah, it's by design, right?
I certainly don't need to rise to celebrity status, particularly in musky fishing. You know, it is one of those things where staying under the radar gets you some benefits. You certainly don't have to worry about people following you to the river. So now I've got a tie-in. So I've got my second tie-in. So I've done my first tie-in, then I've done my first set of feathers, and then a little bit of flash, and then a second tie-in. And now I'm coming back in with another set of long feathers. And I think these are actually slightly shorter than the first group, but that's okay with me. They're going to be equal to each other, even though they're a little shorter than others. And, you know, some of the, you know, serious commercial tyers out there do a really lovely job of tapering their feathers in the back. I do think it looks great, but I also think when it gets wet, you know, it kind of
splitting hairs at a certain level.
I think so. I think it's, you know, it's not the same as you know, like getting your bucktail right, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, the feathers kind of stick out the back. Whenever you tie on a shank, you should sand the burrs, or you will potentially be breaking your thread. So that's the first break of thread.
We've talked about it a little bit. No big deal. Just tie back on over the top. One thing I want to point out while John clips those feather stems is when we're tying this pattern with an up facing stinger in the rear instead of a shank like he is, it's impossible to put a top center feather out of the back. And you can do it if you're tying it on a shank, if you wanted to have 3 feathers out of the back instead of 2. But almost without fail, I'll almost always put a couple sets of tail feathers out the back, a couple sets or more tail feathers out the back of the Hillbilly Deluxe. I really like the look of a couple extra feathers on that jigging larger profile personally.
And I think, you know, we talk a lot about using shanks to create length without long feathers. Another thing to consider is if you don't have really good webby feathers, use more of them. You know, so I'm going to use these barred feathers as an accent, and they are right. Those don't create any body.
They're pretty thin, yeah.
Right. All they're going to do is create a little
contrast.
Yeah, and so that to me is just another way you can go. If you don't have, you know, nice webby schlappen feathers or saddle feathers, you can get by with several feathers where you might have only used 2 or you know, 6 instead of 4. And I think that's okay. I don't always follow my own advice on that, but I think, you know, at the end of the day, we get all these saddles and we tie 25 musky flies, and you look at the saddle and there's tons and tons and tons of feathers left, but none of them that we want to use. There are ways to use those other feathers, you know, whether there are some feathers that you can palmer and, you know, make a giant sort of woolly bugger head or something.
Or if it's for contrast with
or use them for accents, or
lateral line,
or use 10 of them of different colors and create sort of a little more color blending using a bunch of different feathers, where maybe the profile would have been easier to obtain with just a couple of bigger feathers. It's okay. So now I'm back on. I'm not doing another flash yet. I don't do flash between every bucktail tie-in. Some people do. I think I mentioned it last time that I used to use more flash than I do now. A lot of that has to do with the musky waters that I fish in Maine, and a pattern like this would be well suited for a really, really clear water. And so a little bit of flash goes a long way.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. And we talked about it a bit in our last video. John is one of the guys who, we talk a ton about flies and fishing, and whether it's smallie fishing in open water over structure or musky fishing in, varying locations and different conditions. When he's talking about fishing in a crystal clear natural lake where fish are eating very natural forage and they can see very well, you don't need a ton of flash. You don't need the densest fly ever to, get their attention, as opposed to if you're fishing in something, say, very windy conditions and overcast, something where you're going to want to work a little extra hard to get their attention. You might use more material when it's rough out like that. You might use a little bit more flash when it's rough out like that. But yeah, that was a really good point.
Yeah, weather is definitely one of the factors that would determine, what I want that fly to, how much material or how much flash or even what type of fly. But everything is also just a guide, and I break rules almost as often as I follow them. And I think that the way you develop patterns is to break patterns too. So, especially if you're out fishing with a buddy, do something different than your buddy. And one of you has a better chance of figuring it out. And then you can coalesce your patterns after you get some feedback. But as you know, musky fishing is not rife with feedback. So you gotta do what you can. So now I've thrown those accent feathers on. A lot of times I will not add a third set of feathers. These are pretty long, but, really sparse feathers. So, adding them on, I think just makes the pattern maybe look a little nicer, but it's certainly not necessary. The other thing that it does, and this is what I was going to talk about when I got to the front, even though I don't like to add a ton of flash, I'm going to add like some hot spot flash on the top of this fly, because an all black pattern is hard to see as it comes back to the boat or wherever you're fishing from, a rock or the boat, and so often when you're trying to see if you've got a musky following or you want to initiate a really well coordinated figure eight, you need to see the fly. And it's hard enough to see the fly with a jig anyway, because a lot of times it's coming back deep or maybe even somewhat vertical if you're in deep enough water with a fast sinking line. You want a little something to help you see, and that way you can check for followers and also initiate a really good figure eight.
Was it you or was, sorry, go ahead and then I'll ask my question.
I'm now going to throw on some more of this. What did I call this?
Angel hair.
Angel hair. Thank you. Angel hair.
Was it you or was it? I think it might have been Weston Thier. We're talking about why are black and orange flies with a big orange tail seem to be as effective as they are. Was that with you or was that with Weston?
That must have been Weston.
And I don't think it was on the video we did with him either, which we'll probably have kind of an alternate video when we release this. But from a separate conversation, we talked about, to John's point on hotspots, how the way we perceive the reason we perceive that pattern to work like it does is because they can see that orange, they get close and they go, oh, that's bigger. And then they, all of a sudden they have this meaty black profile, but you have to make sure they see it first. So yeah.
And to be honest, I don't even know how they see it. Like maybe they see black better than black and orange. Maybe orange doesn't show up different, like
it
or
disappears.
maybe
Water column,
maybe it gives them different, at different depths it shows differently. But I know how it appears to me, if nothing else. So, when I get that fly coming back, I definitely have interest in picking it up before it gets to me. And so that was something I had not historically done before fishing with Luke. And Luke was a big proponent of that. We would fish black flies with him, but all of his black flies would always have like some green on the top or something quite visible. And he didn't care about it from a fish perspective at all. He wanted his clients to see. And, maybe some people need that more than others, but it definitely helps.
Fly is.
Yeah, like maybe some people have a really good sense of where the fly is. They know how many strips, or they can tell by the angle of the line. But
John does.
For Luke, who's got a bunch of different clients of different capabilities, it makes total sense that he would want something that fished easily, right? That's probably the most important thing for something like a guide consideration, is just to make it as easy on the sports as possible. And seeing it is definitely easier than not seeing it.
It helps, definitely.
Yeah. And so, I think my initial concerns around that would be, well, what if the fish don't like it? And he, as a guide, felt very confident that was not a concern.
I didn't pay attention. I noticed that you reverse tied that one. On the second tie-in, was that also a reverse tie?
Everything except for the first tie-in was reverse tied. And a lot of people, when they get up to the front hook, will do the first tie-in as a regular tie, but I even reverse tie that. That's typically how I do it. I like to create a little window for that articulation to swing.
Mm-hmm.
It probably makes absolutely no difference, but that's
just
the way I feel about it.
Yeah, we talked on the what was the video we just released, the Buford video, how where were we going with that? How I had slightly hollower bucktail for the second tie-in, and how if you had maybe less hollow butts in that tail in that second tie-in section, that maybe you would have reverse tied it. But because we had something that was a little more hollow, we were able to tie that in regular before. So our first two tie-ins are regular before we went to a hollow, but you'll get a feel for that based on the type of tail you have. And as you continue to tie different articulated and single profiles.
So for this front tie-in on the back section, I'm going to use some short hollow stuff from the base of the bucktail. Again, you do not have to do this. This is, if you want the exact same length, the exact same bucktail, that would be absolutely fine. But for me, I like how this kind of creates a little more flared spot right in the front, and it kind of makes it fill in without having all of this length that tends to lay back later.
Is this a similar capacity to how we use like laser dubs sometimes, just to kind of fill the shank and...
Sure, fill the shank, or usually if I were going to use laser dub here, I would do it as a way to do it like a little color contrast that didn't like dominate the back of the fly too. It's like, I don't know, on this one you can see I've gone to like some short belly hair on the back and the front, and it just kind of creates a little pillow effect. I like it. It creates some density without being dominant towards the fly. Now, normally, if you can see why that would work if you're using a different color, but in this case, even with the same color, it gives me a real easy tie-in.
It's interesting because it's not something I do on the rear section very often. I've started doing it occasionally on the front section, like on the head, if you're trying to cover up eyes or fill extra shank space, just because I like the bulk that you get from it. But I like that.
I do a lot of it on the front section, and some of it's for bulk or shape, And it just, when you're tying around the eyes, it flares really easily and sort of does exactly what it's supposed to. And it's, when you're having to work around those eyes, it can be a bit of a challenge. So it's, it's a nice way to deal with it. And so I did a reverse tie on that as well. And there you go. So you can, I don't know if does that show up okay?
It did.
It's maybe if I get out of the way.
No, it's better with you it's better. I'm not going to say this very often. It's better with you in the way.
I'm trying to keep my head as much as I can above the whole thing. So now I'm going to whip finish here, and I'm going to go right to the front. It's good that we can't see the fly too well, because there's some when you use that belly hair, some of it's sticking out the front a little bit here, and I'm not at all worried about that. So now I am going to.
You probably go fish that as is if you wanted, right?
It doesn't have a hook. I'd have to.
Well, you would need a hook. That would definitely be helpful.
Yeah. If I split ringed a hook in, you could probably get away with this. Yeah. Especially in my area where, some of those small flies really fish well for muskies.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I was in one of the local shops earlier, and we were talking about how we made this huge change up in the middle of kind of turnover this year, when it went from being, kind of summery to fall to all of a sudden just really cold. And we switched from kind of 8 to 9 inch profiles to like 5 to 6 inch profiles, and the eats just completely changed. It was just whammo, set the hook on themselves instead of like these like slow pickups off the bottom. And sometimes that is the difference.
Well, and sometimes it works the other way too, right? It could be they really, even on these waters, it seems like a lot of times maybe you don't convert as much, but they react really well. So there's the back. Sometimes they just react really well to big, and sometimes they'll even eat it. And then the question is just, can you get them hooked on a big fly? I think I've seen that so Marlin Prince is a like a prominent guide on the same river system that I fish. So I fish a lot on the St. John and the lakes around the St. John River in Maine, and he fishes much farther down. It's on the Canadian side. It's closer to the ocean, and he's got much bigger muskies on average than we do. But I think he said he still fishes 10 inches or less almost exclusively as far as flies, just because the forage there is on the smaller side, and that's what the muskies seem to like.
Yeah, we actually Marlin will be one of the future videos that we share in the series. He did one of his bucktail changers, and not the biggest profile ever, but it holds a nice profile and it swims well. And
yeah, right. I think he actually does use quite a fair amount of profile, but just not a ton of length, I think. Or the profile doesn't sustain length really far back into the fly.
It was funny because Marlin's, as you know, a fantastic guide, and one of the first tie-ins he did when he's tying this bucktail changer is he actually cuts off like the fine ends of the bucktail, and I typically try to avoid that, but when he did it, I like cringed, and I was like, oh God, what are we doing here? And as he went through the fly, you see kind of the shape that comes out of that tying technique and what he was doing, and it was actually a really cool fly. It's not something I've seen a lot of other people do.
I've seen some striper anglers who are really good anglers and I would say decent tyers as well. Do that with a couple of patterns, particularly crab patterns here, and I feel the same way. I cringe because the bucktail gives you that fiber taper that is so lovely, but at the end of the day, the fish are not examining the taper of the individual hairs.
No, especially if you're swinging it through fast current.
And so at the end of the day, shape and action are what you're looking for in a fly. And, people like Marlin know what they're doing. He's spends time on the water. He's moved a lot of fish. And so if he were concerned about it, I would be too. But if he's not concerned about it, I'm not going to, And I apologize. I got to get some wire cutters.
No, you're fine. While you're grabbing that, I think I just wanted to include one of the things that we talked about with Marlon in his video is the impact to conservation that he has made in his fishery. And it's really incredible to see. I mean, he has been working to try to affect change for the different laws just around, catch limits and length restrictions and stuff like that. And hopefully, knock on wood, hopefully there's a big change coming this year that he's been a big part of. But his understanding of the species and everything that goes into it and the ecosystem in the area and all of the legal side and the politics of it is, it's fascinating. It gets out of control pretty quickly.
Marlon is single-handedly responsible for me joining Musky Forevers because he was the one who notified a lot of us that it was there was a Maine chapter started, and so he's been at the forefront of advocacy in a hostile territory for a really long time. And I say a hostile territory, Maine and into New Brunswick. New Brunswick's obviously got muskies in places, but the St. John River system in particular is historic trout and salmon water. The Maine side had a fair number of brook trout, and I believe down where Marlin fishes historically has had Atlantic salmon. They are not really viable because of the water conditions and the number of dams on the river, particularly down his way. So, saying that, we have to leave the river, or we can't we can't allow muskie to exist in the river because of, a dream of Atlantic salmon is probably, muskie have nothing to do with Atlantic salmon in that river. It's all about other things. And so, but the perception in Maine is that muskie are evil and responsible for the decimation of brook trout and Atlantic salmon and landlocked salmon fisheries in the northern part of the state. The reality is that the timing of muskie arrival and the downfall of those fisheries are not the same. They
absolute
were
misinformation.
well on their way out. Yeah, and muskie really have filled in some gaps in the fishery. Now, I understand the desire to keep them from spreading into waters that remain strong fisheries for trout and salmon, but I think that that really comes down to education and having to what Marlon's advocating for, to having a plan. So
yeah, you're making great points. I'm going to ask a question about your articulation. So it doesn't look like you don't bend your wire back on that articulation there.
Bend my wire back.
Like you don't tie in a section of wire, then fold some back and tie that over. Do you just tie your wire and fold it and then tie it again?
Just tie it in half an inch, maybe a little bit more than half an inch. I think we did talk about it on the smoker video.
We did.
The smoker video, there's no trailing hook. So obviously you don't need a lot of wire to hold it in, but I promise anybody that if you do a solid half-inch tie-in on coated single strand, I'm using American fishing wire,
1x7 or something like that.
1x7 coated, and 60. I think I have 60 pound, but if you use 80 pound, even better, maybe.
I use 90.
If you reef that in, it's going to break at the loop before it comes free.
Yeah, there's definitely some personal preference in there because I like to fold my wire. And I don't know if you've ever seen any old like fly fish food videos with Cheech, but he'll tie in an extra long section of wire and then fold it back and tie in again on it. And at the smaller gauges, especially in articulations, I could see a point for that. Matt Grayesky does not fold his wire back when he does it. His flies have caught tons of different muskies. I do think there's a personal preference thing there. I mean, I like to fold mine back and I know it's overkill. I know that I probably don't have to, but it makes me feel better. Yeah.
I just don't like, tying over it. And so if I have one section on each side of the hook, that's fine. If I have more than that, it's a problem. not a problem. It just makes it a little trickier. So I have a vertical loop on the front of my rear shank. And so we talked about having that loop horizontal to split ring a hook in. I have an offset on the shank itself so that the front of it is vertical, because I like to have my loop horizontal coming off the front hook, because it's on either side of the hook shank and I don't have to deal with the bend of the hook when I'm tying the rear fly, the rear shank in.
Nice.
Basically, this wire I want to bend around either side of the hook, and it's easier to do that horizontally than it is to try to do a vertical loop.
Yeah, if for instance John's loop was horizontal right here, to have the loop in the wire be vertical to the hook shank, you might have to tie either on one side of the shank to have your loop, or diagonally from the top of one side to the bottom of the other side of the shank. But yeah, if you're ever connecting a shank loop to the back of a hook, if you can coordinate the distance, or pardon me, the direction of that shank, the orientation of that loop, it just makes your tie-in a little bit easier.
And I don't know if anybody saw, but I broke my thread again.
They wouldn't have saw it if you didn't point it out. We might have to cut that out. We'll see.
The wire, just like the shanks, the wire has sharp bits that will cut your thread if you hit them with any tension. So I like to, with very little tension, try to cover them up as best I can so that they'll be clear later on. And now I said I like to just do maybe half an inch of overlap on the wire when I attach to the front hook. But I want to reef down on some, I want to get it on there with some thread tension, right? That's what's going to really lock it in. Some people probably put some super glue on the shank before they do it too. That's not a bad idea. I used to do it
right after.
I used to do it. I have become more cavalier once I learned that that's not the failure point.
And he's not selling this one. Man's got places to be.
So the most important thing is the way the hook's going to ride is with the point up on these jig hooks. And so when you loop your back part back in, if there's a top to it versus a bottom, you're doing it upside down. So make sure, like I have more flash on the top than on the bottom. Make sure the flash is riding down, because when you flip it over, it's going to be up. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now I've connected. I just use a short loop, and I don't put any beads or anything like that. If you wanted to try to use the loop to lengthen your fly, you could stick some beads and run it back. You could probably gain another inch if you had some beads to keep it from tangling or folding over. I'm not really doing that. I don't like to do that personally. I'm going to use a little hair clip now and just attach that to my vise so that I can begin tying. And I'm right back to tying in black bucktail, and it's the black bucktail back to the length of the body, not the base bucktail. That makes sense.
Not the itty bitty short stuff, the regular.
Right, and I might even go a little bit longer here, although for this pattern, I don't like long bucktail. And one of the reasons is with the jig hook, the bucktail does tend to get caught on the hook, and it doesn't really foul. It just sort of twists up on the front hook a little bit. It doesn't affect the fishability at all, but it just annoys me a little bit. So
before you tie that in, one of the points we've made on some previous videos is when you're tying your thread base in, if you're spinning your thread, you get these nice little ridges on your hook shank. And when you lash materials down to that, it really seems to cinch those materials down where they don't want to slide, as opposed to if you were doing that thread base and the wire tie-in, in addition to not being able to be as tight to the, with the wire over the wire to the shank with flat thread, you'd have a slippery thread base if you try to do that with flat thread. And when you try to tie in reverse here, some folks, depending on the fly, sometimes I will do a little bump, it's a mood thing, but I'll put a little bump before I do the first tie-in so that when I go to push back my reverse tie, it can't slide. It's not something that's really necessary, but you'll find what works for you there.
So you guys also don't see the prep work that I'm doing with each clump of bucktail that I use, but I'm cutting it, close to the base of my bucktail, or close to the hide. So I'm getting all the length I can of my cuts, mostly to keep this neat. And then I'm pulling out all the under guard hairs by holding it close to the tips and just sort of even pressure, just pulling out guard hairs.
Use a comb or just your fingers with light pressure?
You could use a comb, or I use my fingers repeatedly with light pressure. And then I'm going to, cut it straight with my scissors after I'm holding it in the hand that I'm going to use to apply it for a reverse tie. So I'm holding it in my right hand for a reverse tie because the butts are sticking out the back. And so when I do that, I then use my left hand to bring the bobbin over. And I do it with no thread pressure or minimal thread pressure. And then I do a second one also with minimal thread pressure. Okay. Or pretty little thread pressure. Now on my third one, that's where I'm applying pressure, and you can see that'll run it around the hook. That'll rotate it around the hook. There's at least 1,000 videos about getting the bucktail to
ours are the only ones, John.
Reverse tied bucktail to go around the hook the way you want it.
Musky Town's videos are the only ones in existence.
Okay. There's no such thing as YouTube, I guess.
Hey, we're on there. We're just the only ones.
Yeah. So now, okay, I've got my flare. Because it's a jig hook, I can't use my pen, but I'm just using my fingers to tease that back. And the first tie-in on the front shank is by far the hardest, because you're dealing with where you've already got a lot of thread because of the wire that you've tied in, and the bend of the hook is right there, and the vise is right there. So this is the hardest one to get right.
The hook point too.
So take your time, just kind of working it into the way you want it, and then get in front and start building your thread dam. I did something that's probably a little different than most tyers, and probably even you, on my front flash tie-in. And this is something that, through being a pet peeve of mine over the years, I've begun experimenting in the last couple of years with the placement of flash. Normally, when we tie a lot of the different musky patterns, we'll veil some flash over the top half of the fly, maybe even lower too, a little bit.
Usually on the top, but yeah.
But usually on the top, right? For this particular pattern, because the hook point is up top and wants to grab and tangle flash in particular, I like to do flash focused on both sides of the pattern. I don't go all the way over the top with it, because I don't want it to just start to gum up around the hook. So
did I see you when you folded your flash, then did I see you correctly? You tied it in and you did it on the one side, but then you pushed the other fold over to the other side of the shank and tied that in that way. Is
that's what I did? Yep. And I did not do it very long on these front. I've got some flash out the back that's a little bit long, but in the front, I'm not really doing it long. And so, in particular, as we're in sections of the front hook that are impacted by that point, by the point of the hook, just be, marginally aware of it. When you fish it and it does wrap around the front a little bit, it really doesn't seem to bother the fish. Like the fly still fishes great, but I find myself spending a lot of time on the water if things are not right, just kind of picking at the fly and not fishing it as much as I could be. So as a result, I prefer to keep that flash a little bit off to the sides now. Okay, so now I'm gonna kind of pick up the pace a little bit here just to get towards the front. Maybe one thing to point out, I have not tied eyes on yet. A lot of people, when they tie clouser style or jig style flies, the first thing they do is put a thread bump, secure the eyes to the hook. That's the first thing they do. with these musky flies, those eyes are quite large and they get in the way. So I don't like to do that. And the other reality is when I'm doing these reverse ties, when I get close enough to the front, the reverse tie has a natural bump that comes off of it. That is a great place to push those eyes against and really, really locks them in. You know, on a lot of saltwater patterns, after a certain number of fish, those eyes tend to spin on the shank a little bit. These musky patterns, it really doesn't happen. So I'm off camera. I'm doing another clump of bucktail.
While you're tying that in, I do want to mention, you know, if you're someone who's, you know, we talked a little bit on our river pig video. If you're someone who's just learning to tie eyes in for the first time, or maybe you haven't tied a ton of patterns in a jig style that have weight tied in on the underside of the shank that way, don't get discouraged if your eyes do spin, because it does happen sometimes. But I like John's point that he used about on the front bucktail tie-in at the base of the thread dam, using that as an anchor, so to speak, for your lead eyes, because it will help avoid a little bit of that. It gives you a place to really, as you cinch down, lock everything in right there, specifically for your eyes. And you still have room to, you know, whether you're using marabou or you're palmering a piece of wide schlappen or whatever you like to do as kind of the collar before those eyes, you'll still have room to do that. Like you can tie that over the dam.
Yeah, especially early on. Don't crowd the bend of the hook. You know, like get your eyes in there before you get all the way to the bend. Because if your eyes do tend to run down the bend a little, it's a bit of a pain, although the bend of the hook also is another thing that anchors your thread when you're locking those eyes in.
John, I don't know if you haven't seen that river pig video. I was in between tie-ins if we were going to do another clump or not of bucktail before the eyes, and we decided yes, we wanted to. But then rather than tying the full thread dam before the eyes went in, we tied like kind of a modified thread dam, just enough to hold the bucktail back, and then put our eyes in against that bump. And then we were able to finish our thread dam after.
Yeah, and then another dam after the eyes are in.
Yeah.
Yep. That's a good way to do it. You can actually put a little piece of wire that sticks out, or even the channel lead. If it sticks out ever so slightly, it gives you a little extra room to do that as well. It really comes down to what you want, how far forward you want that weight from an action perspective. Although,
real quick, I want to point out while you were just doing that thread dam. So while doing his thread dam there, John's taper was a little more open on the underside of the shank than perhaps he was after. And so what he did was he did a very steep, he flipped his shank over, but he did a very steep angled thread dam to specifically push that part of the taper down. And that's an important technique to do. I mean, I do it all the time.
It's a corrective maneuver.
Well, when we're talking, we're maybe not paying perfect attention to, you know, the axis of the.
Yeah, otherwise that would never happen to me. All right, a little more flash here. And again, I want it to be, I'm not trying to do it as a clump. I'm trying to do it as a veil, but just on the side.
So that's a pretty sparse amount of flash then that you're using.
Yeah. I think you'll definitely see it. You'll definitely see it in the water, and they'll definitely see it.
But you're not,
I think because it's bronze, it doesn't show up super great, probably on camera, especially. But I think it'll look okay in the water. And I'm just gonna kind of, the angel hair does, like, if you're not careful, it will kind of clump. Not that that's a problem per se, but all right. So I'm continuing to go forward. I don't know how many on your river pig, how many sets of bucktail you ended up doing, but it's going to end up being 6 or so on this with the size tie-ins that I do.
When you're doing a 5/0 round bend there, right?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, so that Gamakatsu round bend jig hook, that 60-degree jig hook, is definitely one of our favorites. When we did the 4/0, I want to say we did 3 or 4 tie-ins, and it depends on your specific bucktail and which material you have.
Well, and you also have feathers on the front, whereas my feathers are on the rear shank, right? So this is all bucktail, no feathers to this point, at least.
Yeah, you end up with a little bit more room that way. Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
You have a lot of options in jig flies, and a lot of these platforms, whether you're tying a shank or a hook or a combination of them are still pretty new. So like, don't feel like if you're someone who's just starting to tie, like you gotta be locked into this, like mix it up, try different stuff. Like you may uncover the next big advancement in musky and predator fly tying.
Well, and when you hear me talk about the things that I'm doing, a lot of them come out of problems that I'm trying to solve with my local fishery. And yes, I am doing another corrective steep wrap. So, I think that's the key, is get out there and fish your flies and then say, okay, what do I want this fly to do? And then make adjustments for the next time so that you're getting what you need to meet a particular need for your fishery or your fishing style. I definitely fish probably more jigs than most of the people I fish with. It's just something that I have a lot of confidence in and feel a lot of comfort with. And sometimes it works great, and other times it's probably not I probably put too much emphasis on jigs when there's other things that could have done the job. But that's what everybody's got to figure out is, okay, what works and why and where, so if you're fishing, deep water areas, you're probably going to gravitate towards putting more weight in your jigs than if somebody's fishing, 5-foot bogs with a lot of weeds, Another clump here. Here we go. And based on the length of the bucktail that I have, I'm cutting, for this front part of the fly, I'm having to cut about 1/2 inch off of the bucktail. And I'm okay with that. I'm comfortable with that. If you have to cut the bucktail like in the middle in order to get the length you want, it's probably not going to flare like I'm looking for it to, because you're cutting essentially the hollow part of the bucktail out.
You're making a great point. We talked on the first river pig video, some of the browns and camels and those different tails had hollow that extended, 3/4 of an inch plus up the base of the bucktail fiber. But on the last Buford video, the bucktail we had this really nice hollow about 1/4 inch of the way up. And if you try to cut any of that to adjust your length, you weren't going to get the spin that you want or the flare that you want, or it wasn't going to hold the profile against the thread dam that you were trying to make it.
Right. And, there's always ways to compensate for that. You can work it around with your hand. You can leave it long. You can, a lot of those different options are available to you. It really comes down to, what you want to do and whether you want to stick to something that makes the bucktail easy to work with. And, obviously having some hollow stems on that bucktail really helps it to flare. All right. So now I'm getting pretty close to the front. I don't know if we can see that or not. I'm talking about 1/2 inch left. And so I'm going to do one more bucktail tie-in before I put the eyes on.
Will you do pectoral fins on this one?
Yeah, I'm going to do pectoral fins first. That's just what I was going to introduce. I've got these same, shorter versions of those same accent flies that I used on the tail. These are just regular barred
grizzly.
Barred grizzly, yeah. So just little grizzly feathers, and I'm gonna let these be. I think they're about 3 inches long. They go, I don't know, an inch overlapping the tail of the fly, and probably go to right to about to where the tips of the bucktail from my first tie-in on the front hook goes, if that makes sense. It doesn't really matter, right? You want it to stick out enough so that it shows, because I'm going to tie more materials in front of it. I don't want to completely cover it up. But
Proportions.
Other than that,
I mean, we just talked about, like, I usually like my pectoral fin feathers to be a hair shorter than the bucktail tie-in before them. But again, that's if I'm using a hen saddle, and it depends on the fly. Maybe they'll extend about a third of the fly back. Some feathers, it'll be a quarter of the way back. It just depends the fly.
Yeah, and particularly, a black fly, because a black fly has got a really solid profile from my perspective all the way through. And so I like to have a little something that helps me see it, helps it sort of have a little flair from my perspective.
Contrast, yeah. Flair, contrast, complexity, whatever you want to call it.
So now I'm getting pretty close to the front of the hook, and I want to institute that concept that I talked about earlier that Luke is a big proponent of, which is putting something visible. And if you have it on the high side towards the head, that's where you're going to see that fly first. It's the first thing that's going to come into view, and that'll give you a really good sense of where your fly is. Now, I don't want to get it all gummed up in the hook, so I'm going to do a veil of this. I think it's shimmer fringe, and so this has got some yellow, some purple, and maybe a little pearl in it. And I'm going to take about that much, it's a fair amount, but I'm going to keep it pretty short. Right? I just want I'm going to give it a little pop in the front. And so running over, I'm going to do a couple of really nice tight thread wraps, and then I'm going to just kind of put it where I want it. And then I'm going to cinch it down. And I don't want it to be a gob. I want it to be a veil.
Oh, not like that.
It's perfect. In fact, this fly is perfect. It's money.
If you're somebody who, especially as you're diving down the rabbit hole that is tying flies, that doesn't want to do it wrong, I was one of those types getting into it. I will repeat the mantra that John shared with me, and there are no rules. There are some rules and preferences, but don't hold yourself back by being afraid to do it wrong. I mean, you really are. We all develop our own tying style, and the sooner you embrace that you may do something different than someone else, whatever you're trying to do, as long as you have a reason behind it, go for it.
Or even if you don't, even if your only reason is just, I want to see what happens. I have plenty of flies that I tie and then throw right in the trash, or cut all the materials off to reclaim the hook. And then I also have, several flies that come off the vise and I go, ugh. And then I bring them to the water and they swim amazing, or I think they're going to be awesome, and they get to the water and they swim seemingly terribly, and I'm about to take them off and something comes up and eats them. So, nobody's perfect, but these. So now, just to get back on point, I've done a little bit of something to see in the front, and I'm doing one more bucktail tie-in with. So now I've got cheeks and some flash, and I'm gonna do one more bucktail tie-in. I'm gonna do this one a little shorter, and then I'm gonna tie in the eyes. So to get a little bit of taper, this is the only one that I've done shorter than the others. And it's absolutely, particularly with this, like for other patterns, you might want to leave, you might need to go shorter as you get to the front because you need more density, or you need to leave it steeper so that you can create action using that bulk. And the only way to do that and not sacrifice your profile is to go really short. With this, we're not tying in a dense amount of materials per se. Even if I do the same length, it'll lay back when I strip it in a bit, and so that'll be, it'll still have a good profile and good action because it's getting most of its action for this pattern from the weight. And again, as you get towards the front of the hook, the jig style hook becomes a little more problematic. You know, it's just sort of, you've got to work around the bend.
You know, you triggered one thing I want to mention while you're doing that, but if you're someone who's tying a different variation of the jig fly on this platform, say you tied a shank in the front and a hook on the back, or even if you're doing a single on a long shank, or, you know, there's a few different versions of this. When you go and swim that fly, if you're not thrilled about it, and it will happen sometimes, don't be afraid to try bending your shank. Don't go crazy with it, but I think Sully taught us that initially as one of the things that he's done on certain flies to get them to swim spectacularly. But it's a technique that I've had really good success with, even if it's just trying to increase the action on a fly out of the personal box, or maybe something that I tied a long time ago on a shank, and before I'm ready to call it quits on it, I want to mess with it.
Yeah, I've brought some scissors out with me too, and done some on water modifications.
What types of modifications will you do while you're on the water?
I'll cut away, like if a fly is rolling on its side, but I want to see, like maybe I'm intrigued by a profile or something, but it's rolling on its side, I might thin out the materials on the bottom of the fly, so that the buoyant materials on the top of the fly have more impact to orient that fly, for instance. Or if I think a fly looks really good, but it doesn't have the action I want, I might thin out the tail a little, because I think, you know, having bulk in the tail is something that will potentially rob action. Whereas, you know, sparsing the tail out a little bit will give you a little more natural tendency of action.
Kind of like the opposite of a drag car. Like rather than that big parachute, slowing it down and straightening it out, you're removing that stabilization out of the back of the fly so that hopefully the water pushes around the front and kicks it to a side.
Right. So many of these flies have bulk in the front, which water runs over that bulk. It tends to break the fly, but also water runs over it and then gets turbulent and shimmers off the back. Mm-hmm. Well, if you have too much in the back, it dampens that. If you have too much in the back, it tends to become a drag on the fly, and you want the back to kind of push forward, because that generally will promote further action. If the back of the fly is pushing forward, the front of the fly is tending to stop because that's where the bulk is. Something's got to give. Usually gives in the form of turning. So now I've not got much room here at all, but I'm gonna go ahead and get these eyes on, right tight against that bump, and I'm gonna hold them and go twice over this way, and then twice over the other way. And I know a lot of people just do regular figure 8 wraps, but I usually do a series of wraps one direction, you know, so in front on the left, in back on the right, and then reverse that so that it's in front on the right, on the opposite of what I just said, you know. So you do sort of counter wraps,
I work
but I do
both
several.
techniques in.
I do several at once, and so what that does is it creates diagonal wraps around the whole thing, and when you finish it, you'll finish it by not even going under the hook. You'll just under the eyes, and it cinches all of those diagonal wraps together. So that really creates a lot of extra tension. So I'm doing that to demonstrate it now. But these eyes are so big that you can really build some thread dam in there. And again, the bend of the hook is causing my thread to trap underneath the hook so that it's not gonna fall off, right? It's really cinching it in. And so the hooks on these jig hooks are great for adding lead eyes because they really lock in. Okay, so now I've got my eyes on, and it doesn't look bad. Could fish this fly as it is right now, or I could do something to cover the thread wraps, build a little bit more between the eyes and the end of the bucktail. And so I think the traditional river pig uses like a big palmered schlappen feather, so wrap a schlappen and tie it back, although there's tons of different variations on
Marabou
that.
is my favorite. Marabou gives me a little more flexibility on if I want to go slow retrieve or depending what you're doing.
Marabou creates great, movement. It looks great. I love Marabou. Maybe I'll do a Marabou. You could also use some laser dub.
Yep.
That really kind of creates some perception of bulk up there.
I especially like to do that. I especially like to use Marabou in that utility if I'm going to be tying or if I'm going to be drawing like lines on a perch or something like that. Because you can mark it.
Maybe I'm going to regret this. This is probably a harder way to finish it. But the other thing you can do is a little bit more belly hair, right? And I could do high and low.
Let's do that. That sounds fun.
The only problem with doing that is if you tie it in straight, not a reverse tie, the stems are going to stick forward, And again, for my own personal flies, I don't care. That doesn't matter. Or if you reverse tie it, you just need to. You're working with not a lot of space. So I'm going to do it. I'm going to do a reverse tie. If it doesn't work, then I won't make this fly available on Musky Town.
I think you broke your thread too many times for us to sell that one. So
you think what?
I said I think you broke your thread on that one too many times for us to sell that one. I'm just busting.
Oh, that's a shame. This is
that's a good looking fly, man.
This is definitely, the smoker pattern. I was playing around with some colors and maybe my bucktail wasn't consistent all the way back to front, and it's all right. It'll catch fish. This one, I can tell that this is going to be a relatively fishy fly.
Oh, that thing looks real fishy. My area. The profile on that looks great.
So if we want to finish this with some belly hair, and I took some belly hair and I cut it really quite short. This is not going to flare all the way around the hook. So you have to do it top and bottom. And so you're going to have to hold it with some tension to get that. The reason why it won't flare all the way around the hook is because those eyes are in the way, right? So I'm going to do the top first because it's much tougher. And so one, two, and I'm gonna hold it right here because I don't want it to spin. I just want it to flare. All right, so now I've got the top. Technically speaking, you could probably just do one side or the other too, but I'll go ahead and do the top and bottom. And I will tie them back together, even though I'm tying them on separately. If that makes sense.
And this would be a similar technique if you were, if somebody wanted to do like a two-tone reverse tie with different colors on the top and bottom of their hollow ties anywhere else on the fly. You tie one in, get it where you want it. You tie the other one, get it where you want it, then push that back and build your thread dam as if you tied them in at the same time.
Absolutely correct. Okay. Lengthwise, I want to make sure they're relatively matched, or a little longer on top than the bottom is the other way you can do it. So now I've got the eyes to contend with, right? So when I try to trap this down, I can't get it as tight to the hook as I would like because the eyes are in the way. So I'm going to actually switch hands, hold the butts down directly to the hook, and then wrap. So now I've got front, top and bottom, and I'm just going to tease those fibers back, just like it was a reverse tie where I've allowed it to flare all the way around the hook. I'm going to hold it back as best I can.
And there is no tool for this whatsoever, just to
There's
be
no
clear, because of
tool.
those eyes.
This is probably like your first one. This is probably not the way you want to do it.
Yeah, if it's your first one, Palmer or Marabou feather, like the river pig, or if you want to do the same thing with a piece of wide schlappen, you get kind of a cool grizzly effect. If you were to do that, was the other way I pictured finishing this.
If you feel really brave, go ahead for some laser dub. And now I'm just going to use as much thread as I need to finish this and get those flares where I want them. All right, so there we go.
That's fishy, man.
That's a river pig. What is it called?
This is somewhere between a river pig and a hillbilly deluxe, but
Hillbilly Deluxe, yeah.
On our path toward tying articulated flies, this is something that this would be a good place to start.
Yeah, it's essentially a Hillbilly Deluxe, although I left out the back hook.
Perfect.
So there we go. And I'm terrible with the names. You know, that's why I call things really simple, like, oh, it's a jig. And so, you know, black is a great color for a jig or any other fly. And give it a try, you know, and give it all different kinds of weight and see what happens. But I hope you enjoy it as much as I do.
John, thank you. Seriously, thank you. Always a pleasure to get a glimpse inside of how you're looking at tying different patterns and fishing them. Everyone who has tuned in to watch this, thank you again for being part of Musky Town and for watching Tying with the Pros. We'll see you on the next one.